Okay, here is our lecture on eating and feeding disorders. I am going to focus on the three main disorders in the eating disorder chapter: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. And what I really want to focus on is how the criteria overlaps and what separates these three disorders from each other. And then the second thing I want to focus on is the social, cultural etiology of eating disorders. And I have here the four main lines of research associated with that. All right, let's start with how we separate these three disorders. So I kind of color-coded, I don't know how easy it is to see, but as you can see, there are three different criteria for anorexia nervosa. The main one here, and what really separates anorexia from everything else, is that there are behaviors that do not allow an appropriate weight. That's what this means here, does not allow an appropriate weight. So usually that means starving, or what we would call the restricting type of anorexia nervosa. So the individual does not eat enough, does not take in enough nutrients in order to maintain a healthy weight. There is some flexibility here, and so if a person starts losing weight rapidly but yet hasn't reached a level where they're no longer a healthy weight, it could still be classified as anorexia nervosa. It used to be that you had to be below a certain BMI, but the BMI, the body mass index, is not a perfect way of determining weight, and so that has gone away. So this is the main criteria here for anorexia and how it's separated. People with anorexia usually look really, really thin. The second one is a fear of gaining weight. Of course, they look really, really thin, so they have a fear of gaining that weight. And the third one here is disordered image. Body image, so they see themselves and they think they are fat when in fact they are really, really skinny. This is similar to the criteria over here for bulimia nervosa. And as I mentioned, there's a restricting type, but there's also this binge-purge type. So individuals with anorexia nervosa can binge and purge. It sometimes looks different from bulimia, but that is not necessarily the separating behavior. All right, over here for bulimia, we have reoccurring binges. And binges are essentially taking in typically large amounts of high caloric food in a short amount of time. And this is going to look different for each person. So eating an entire pizza might seem like a binge for one person, where it could just be a regular old Friday night for somebody else. Maybe somebody who's an athlete who burns a lot of calories at a time. But the cycle is really a big part here. So we've got a binge, but then we've also got compensatory behaviors. So they're getting rid of those calories after they have binged. And so this is often through purging through vomiting, but it can also be purging through laxatives. It can also be excessive exercise. There's different ways of purging, but we certainly see this cycle with bulimia nervosa. With individuals who have bulimia, they typically are not underweight. And that's one way that we can kind of separate them. They're often either average weight or even a little overweight. So the textbook talks a little bit about how they diet, and then they break their diet, and that break turns into a binge. And that's really what we see with bulimia, whereas with anorexia nervosa, it's sort of a continuous starvation kind of component. They have this sort of thinking where they place a lot of value upon their weight and their body type. But then we also have a time thing here. We don't have that with anorexia. So it has to happen about once a week for at least 3 months. This time thing is similar to binge eating disorder. We have the same kinds of binges, we have the same time frame, but what separates it is there's no compensatory behaviors. So there are some negative things associated with it, such as eating when you're not full, feeling bad about eating. There's 5 different categories, and you have to have 3 of them. Then there is a whole category that's just called distressful eating. So you are distressed by the amount of food that you're eating. So it's not like you're like, oh, I think I want to binge tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and eat a bunch of ice cream. You're actually distressed by your eating. You simply can't stop yourself. And that's really what we see with all of them, is this lack of control. So there's a lot of overlap, as you can see. Diagnosing the difference between these in a practical setting sometimes can be very difficult. The last thing I really want to focus on is the social cultural etiology. We haven't seen that a lot in some of the disorders, but for eating disorders, it's a big one. So there's 4 lines of research here that really give us a lot of evidence that the culture that we live in is a big part of why eating disorders are predominant. So one, we've seen that eating disorders have actually increased over time. And we know that our culture has really valued, that's my timer, has really valued thinness more and more over time. And so that suggests that the changing culture is why eating disorders has been on the rise. Number 2, we do see an imbalance of sex ratio, which means that women get diagnosed more than men do. If it wasn't sociocultural, then why do we have a sex difference? That would be one of the arguments here, because women and their weight is seen different in our culture than men and their weight. That's the argument. The third thing is that there is a correlation in research between eating disorders and internalizing what we call the thin ideal, or the idea that being thin is the best way of being in the world. We do have a correlation over and over again of those two things. And finally, when we do cultural studies, we see that there is an imbalance. Cultures that really idealize thinness have higher prevalence rates of eating disorders rather than cultures that don't. The Becker study, which was done on the island of Fuji and looked at eating disorder rates before Western TV was introduced and then after it was introduced, is a big part of this research here. It shows that once Western TV was introduced and we see all these thin actresses and how thinness is sort of attractive, we saw an increase of eating disorders in the island of Fuji, in the island country of Fuji. So really take a peek at that. Social cultural arguments, I think, are really strong when it comes to eating disorders, and also pay attention to how we sort of separate out these 3 main eating disorders.